200 photographs of the war on the Danube, of which only a handful survive. A faded but unique account of this conflict between Russia and Islam. To photograph the Russian army, Zatmari packed his darkroom into a wagon and travelled along the Danube. Under fire from Turkish artillery, he reached the Tsar's troops on the other side. For weeks, these Russian soldiers had been besieging the Turkish fort of Silistra, which stood in the way of their advance on Constantinople. Among them, a 26-year-old artillery officer was busily recording the war in letters and diaries. His name was Leo Tolstoy, and his experiences would contribute to his epic novel War and Peace. From his regimental camp, Tolstoy had a comfortable view of the action.
You could see the town, the fortress, and the little forts of Silistra as though on the palm of your hand. You could hear the cannon fire and the rifle shot, which continued night and day. And, with a field glass, you could make out the Turkish soldiers.
Down below, the ordinary soldiers died in skirmishes or under bombardment from the cannon. But for artillery officers like Tolstoy, it was a faraway spectacle, something to enjoy.
It's true, it's a funny sort of pleasure to see people killing each other. And yet, every morning and every evening, I would get up on my cart and spend hours at a time watching. The spectacle was truly beautiful, especially at night.
The top priority for the Allies was to relieve the siege of Silistra, so they embarked for Varna on the Black Sea coast. For Private Harry Blishen in the Rifle Brigade, the glamour of war was wearing thin.
We were drilled incessantly during this time to give the young generals an insight of what they would have to do in the field, and I'm sorry to say we lost several men through the effect. That is why the French have such an advantage over us. You'll never see an inexperienced young officer in their service.
Another man to see the difference was William Howard Russell, the most famous journalist of the war. Russell wrote for the Times of London, and his reports would do much to dispel any illusion that British was automatically best.
The French manage these things better than we do. Where is the English post office? No one knows. Where does the English general live? No one knows. Does anyone want to find General Canrobert? Ask the first Frenchman you meet, and he will tell you to go up the Corso, turn to the right by the end of the Rue l'Hôpital, and you will see the name of the general printed in large letters over the door of his quarters.
The French were much more prepared than the British, but there are very good reasons for that. One reason, probably the main reason, is that the French army was a permanent army with permanent services such as health, clothing, weapons, equipments. Don't forget that the French army had been at war in Algeria since 1830. They were, well, the soldiers and the officers, all of them were very much experienced on the ground.
On the Danube, the Russian High Command stepped up the pressure on the Turkish stronghold of Silistra before British and French reinforcements could arrive.
The period that precedes an engagement is the most unpleasant. It's the only moment when you have time to be afraid. Towards 3 o'clock, we were waiting to see the shower of rockets let off as the signal for an attack. All of a sudden, an aide-de-camp of the field marshal arrived with the order to cancel the attack and end the siege.
The entire Russian army felt betrayed. Austria had intervened and forced the Tsar's troops to abandon their advance into Turkey's European provinces. The gates of Silistra would remain closed to the Russian army.
I can say, without fear of error, that this news was received by us all, soldiers, officers, and generals, as a terrible misfortune.
The whole venture had been a fiasco for the Russians, who retreated back across the Danube. They had unleashed events they could not control, a war that would soon engulf their homeland. It was now the height of summer. The water was contaminated, and the soldiers were living in cramped conditions which would quickly turn murderous. These watercolours are part of a visual diary kept by a talented officer in the Rifle Brigade. Captain Henry Clifford was 28 years old and came from an aristocratic Catholic family. In August, he reported the onset of the disease all soldiers dreaded.
The cholera came at a time when we were all low-spirited and disgusted with the tiresome life we are leading. So bad has it been with the French, the medical men say it is no use fighting it. Fine young men in perfect health are taken ill and die in 4 and 5 hours. I grieve very much for a young officer who came out here from England. He arrived on Tuesday, was taken ill on Wednesday morning, and buried that evening.
The indomitable Fanny Jubilee had also arrived with her husband, Henry.
We are encamped on the cholera-stricken grounds just vacated by the Heavy Brigade. Here and there, a heap of loose earth with a protruding hand or foot showed where local inhabitants had desecrated the dead and dug them up to possess themselves of the blankets in which they were buried.
As the cholera struck the army at Varna, it also spread to the sailors on the warships which were offshore. And as sailors died, they were sewn up in canvas bags which were weighted at the bottom and were thrown overboard. But as the bodies decomposed, they rose to the surface and were bobbing up and down as if they were looking at the live sailors still on board ship, which was extremely disconcerting for them.
The change in the physical appearance of everybody is most marked. All seem as if a dozen years of hard suffering had been added to their lives. The hospital tents present a ghastly spectacle of suffering beyond all relief by human aid. Our detachment have already begun what is likely to be their chief occupation: burying the dead. Frederick Robinson, Assistant Surgeon, Scots Fusilier Guards.
The British and French armies had been at war for 4 months. They had lost 10,000 men, but not a single shot had been fired at the enemy. Finally, the crucial order was given. They would embark for the Crimea to destroy Russia's Black Sea stronghold at Sevastopol. Captain Clifford finished off his watercolours.
1,000 pities our army did not go at Sebastopol on first leaving England, when in rude health and full of spirits and enthusiasm. All of these have vanished. We've been kept in idleness, with hundreds falling around us by cholera and fever, and everyone feels the greatest repugnance to activity of any kind. I hope I may be able to write in a few days and tell you Sebastopol is taken, but I doubt it.
So the Allied fleet set sail again, but without any clear idea of where they were going to land.
Raglan and the French second-in-command went in Raglan's steam yacht and sailed up and down the coast looking for a suitable place to land. They actually sailed quite close to Sevastopol, close enough so that they could make out officers and men on the forts at Sevastopol, and as the ships sailed by, Raglan and his comrades raised their hats to the Russians on land, which was a courtesy which certainly wouldn't have been repeated in any war since.
After exchanging courtesies, the Allied fleet sailed north along the coast. Eventually, Raglan sighted a wide bay with the ominous name of Calamita and gave the order to disembark. At dawn on the 14th of September 1854, This barren shoreline was suddenly crowded with men, including the Times war correspondent, William Howard Russell.
From one extremity to the other, bayonets glistened and red coats glinted. The air was filled with our English speech, and the hum of voices mingled with the loud notes of command, the familiar address of Bill to Tom or Pat to Sandy, and an occasional shout of laughter.
But the excitement of landing in the Crimea could not conceal the usual bad planning.
Amid a gathering of doctors on the beach, I spied my friend Alexander, who was very angry. "Do make a note of this," he said. "They have landed this army without any kind of hospital transport or carts or anything. With all this cholera and diarrhea about, there are no means of taking the sick down to the boats."
Nevertheless, the Russians were impressed.
The whole of their light fleet was anchored within Calamity Bay, and at night their forest of masts was illuminated with various colored lanterns. The soldiers said, "Behold, the infidel has built another holy Moscow on the waves," comparing the masts of the ships to the church spires of that city. Captain Khodasevich, Tarutin Regiment.
The next day, the Russians saw some 60,000 men stretched over the plain below. Just 5 days after landing, the Allied commanders decided they were ready to march on Sebastopol and finish the war. After 2 days' march, the Allies settled down to camp for the night. Above the river Alma, a Russian army of 40,000 was waiting for them. Their commander, Prince Menshikov, was so confident of victory that he'd invited Sebastopol's most fashionable set to join him on the heights with champagne, chicken, and opera glasses. They were treated to a spectacle, but not the one they expected. To advance on Sebastopol, the Allied army had to cross the river Alma and ascend the bare hillside under the fire of heavy Russian artillery. It looked impossible, but the Allies had a plan. The crack French troops, the Zouaves, were sent along the coast to scale the cliffs and seize the heights above the Russian army. The attack on both fronts was scheduled to start at dawn. A Zouave called André wrote home about what happened next.
The mist spread a wispy veil over us, which concealed us from the enemy. The humidity of the night had slightly numbed us, but we were full of spirit. Suddenly a messenger arrived to request us to call a halt. The English gentlemen were not yet ready to leave, so we would have to await their pleasure. We were not particularly polite about them, let me tell you.
It was nearly midday before the British were ready. Private Timothy Gowing had to cross the river Alma with cannonballs whistling towards his company.
As soon as the enemy's round shot came hopping along, we simply did the polite. Opened out and allowed them to pass on. There's nothing lost by politeness, even on a battlefield. Presently they began to pitch their shot and shell right amongst us. And our men began to fall. I felt horribly sick. Cold shiver running through my veins.
Down by the sea, the French Zouaves were finally given the order to scale the cliffs.
So voila, we set off boldly, 250 of us, clambering like cats, urging one another on. When our battery emerged upon the plateau, the guns made terrifying breaches in the enemy lines, and you could see whole rows of Russian infantry mowed down by the same cannonball.
On the main battlefield, Private Gowing and the Royal Fusiliers were advancing straight towards the big Russian guns.
We were only about 600 yards from the mouth of the guns. The thunderbolts of war were not far apart, and death loves a crowd. havoc among the Fusiliers was